Some things must be learned the hard way. Robert, an exhausted single father, gets a crash course in parenting when he buys a fancy new teddy bear to watch and entertain his young son. Robert is a dad who just wants to keep his 2-year-old son, Tyler, safe. After his wife Anna died during childbirth, Tyler is really all he's got left. Robert is constantly battling with thoughts of depression over his wife's death and his own self-inadequacy, but Tyler's well-being is more important to him than his own inner demons, though caring for Tyler as a single parent does interfere with Robert having any fun. While out shopping, Tyler spots a Freddy Fazbear toy which he falls in love with. Robert had never taken Tyler to a Freddy Fazbear's pizzeria, so this affection towards Freddy probably came from a commercial or cartoon on TV. Fredbear and Friends, perhaps? Robert discovers that this specific toy has some interesting capabilities. Tagalong Freddy is a kid's and parents' best pal. Freddy goes where your little one goes and sends you live updates on your tag-along time wristwatch included, so you'll know your little one is happy and safe. You may have to be out of sight sometimes, but Tagalong Freddy is the bear who will always be there. Robert buys the toy, sets up the watch, and Tyler begins carrying around Freddy everywhere he goes. Every once in a while, Robert will get a message on the tag-along wristwatch like fast asleep or messy fun with finger paints, which gives Robert some relief to know that he knows what Tyler's up to when he's out of sight or at daycare. At one point, Robert leaves Tyler and tag-along Freddy in their backyard sandbox to go and pick up a phone call, but Robert returns to find a singular word on his wristwatch: gone. Tyler is gone, and tag-along Freddy is just sitting there. Robert notices their gate open and a white van driving off, but other than that, he doesn't know what happened. He calls the cops to report his son as abducted, but it takes time for the cops to do an investigation. Robert is left more broken than ever, with Anna dead and Tyler missing. He feels like he's failed both his wife and son, truly the lowest of lows. And then, Robert gets a message on the wristwatch. Why don't you go to the cliffs? The context to this is that Robert's house is near some cliffs, with one nicknamed Jumper's Cliff, which is where most in the town would go to commit suicide. The reason Robert's bungalow was so cheap is because of its distance relative to those cliffs. Robert believes that the plush is pushing him to commit suicide, but he isn't having any of it. He throws the plush away to be rid of it. The police get back to Robert with how the investigation is going, but yet again he receives a message from the plush. At this point, Robert is infuriated. He takes the plush out of the trash and proceeds to repeatedly punch it, but that isn't really doing much. So he grabs some matches, lighter fluid, and torches the plush, leaving it inside his garbage can to burn. Why don't you go to the cliffs? This time, Robert puts the plush on the driveway and then proceeds to run it over repeatedly. Why don't you go to the cliffs? Robert takes a pair of scissors and repeatedly stabs the plush where its heart should be. Why don't you go to the cliffs? Why don't you go to the cliffs? Why don't you go to the cliffs? Robert has finally had enough of the plush. He smashes the wristwatch but realizes there's only one way to end this: to go to the cliffs. Once there, Robert hucks the plush off Jumper's Cliff, giving the plush exactly what it wanted. That is, until Robert hears something. Could it be crying? As he walks down the cliffside, he notices an opening with none other than Tyler inside. It turns out that while Robert was away, Tyler spotted a dog and followed it, which led him down the cliffs. Why don't you go to the cliffs? Robert and Tyler return home, where Robert has received a new outlook on life and finally takes pictures of Anna out of the attic to let Tyler know about his mom. I'll say from a personal standpoint, this was a very interesting story, especially the big twist, which caught me by surprise. Though besides that, there's still some interesting things that should be pointed out. First of all, this isn't exactly something mentioned in the story, but it turns out Hurricane Utah has some cliffs surrounding the town. Just an interesting connection I made. Now, back to the story. The idea of a father using a plush to monitor his son is of course meant to parallel an idea about FNAF 4 we've had for quite a while. What exactly is the crying child's Fredbear plush? While some think that the plush is possessed, I think that's only half right. You see, there's this theory that hardcore theorists might recognize as Will plush, which is the idea that the Fredbear plush is a creation of William's meant to allow constant monitoring of the crying child. The idea really sparked with Sister Location, where we had that exact Fredbear plush holding a controller of some sorts. Considering that Scott uses the next game to explain things from the last, it became entirely possible that there could be more to the plush than meets the eye. How the theory works is that William would be monitoring and speaking to the crying child through the week of FNAF 4 up until the bite, at which point a spirit, most likely Charlotte, would take form of the plushie in his coma to speak to the crying child during his death, with that appearance also carrying over to FNAF World as well. This sudden change of speakers would be due to a sudden shift in text color from the plush, with William speaking in #FFFF57, which is a similar color of orange to orange guy, who is also most likely William, and Charlotte speaking in #FFFFA0. How all this relates to the Cliffs is basically the reoccurring premise of a father using a plushie to monitor his son. Simple enough, right? Well, we also have a similar premise presented in The Real Jake, where Jake's father Evan talks to him through a doll hidden in the cabinet across from him. Now, while I do see the skepticism for Will plush, with the idea showing up in not one but two stories, I feel pretty confident that this is what Scott's been trying to hint at with The Real Jake and the Cliffs. Now, while we're on the topic of Will plush, this next idea doesn't exactly relate to the Cliffs, but is still very interesting. The remote from the Sister Location private room appears to have 4 rows with 4 buttons in each row, and a speaker at the bottom. The speaker would of course be used to communicate with the crying child, but what could those buttons be for? Well, it just so happens that I discovered that there are 16 areas to the FNAF 4 minigames, just like the 16 buttons. Knowing this, I would assume the buttons either switch which plush camera view is active, or which plushie William would be speaking through, potentially both. While all this could be a big coincidence, with all that we've learned so far, I highly doubt it. Now, with all that out of the way, there's not exactly anything else I can say for certain about the story, except that there's a chance it's meant to elaborate on Mrs. Afton. Though before that, here's something interesting from the other stories as context. Some things we know about Jake are that in his story he's 9, he got the tumor when he was 6 years old, and his mother died when he was 5 years old. What's so important about this is that we have a similar scenario with a father in Bunny Call whose mother also died when he was 5. With a mother's absence at 5 being a recurring theme, I would assume that the crying child was 6 turning 7 in 1983, with Mrs. Afton having left in 1982, which is when the crying child was 5. Where the Cliffs comes into play is on how Mrs. Afton may have died during childbirth, though that idea doesn't exactly work when applied to this formula. If she dies when the crying child is 5, then she would be giving birth to Elizabeth in 1982, and assuming that Elizabeth's death is prior to the bite, she would be around 1 or 2 when she dies, which doesn't really work. The problem with picking out ideas from these stories is that there's a lot of conflicting information, such as this, though I have a personal solution. Basically, I just choose to accept what appears more often, and in this case, it's the formula rather than the death at childbirth. Since we have the immortal and the restless, which clearly shows marital issues, I would assume that Elizabeth is born around the same time as the crying child, then dies in 1982 or early 1983, which causes Miss Afton to leave the family behind. And that, my viewers, was The Cliffs. If you've got any ideas or details I may have missed, then feel free to leave it in the comments, but that's about it for now. But I do have one final question for you. Why don't you go to The Cliffs?